Paul Nunes-Dier. I'm a certified professional facilitator from the IAF, which stands for International Association of Facilitators. Since 2018, I've started a book series on architecting collaboration, and my latest book, in co-authorship with Martin Duffy and other renowned digital facilitators and guest co-authors, is titled Beyond Virtual Meetings. It's all about the importance of the digital tools that can extend and augment the power of you as a facilitator and a meeting host in virtual online meetings, but also on the hybrid meetings that are going to be so much needed in this post-pandemic era. Along with my co-author Martin Duffy and esteemed PhD colleague, we host Talk to Your Meeting Daughters, a series of hosted conversations with meeting experts that can advise you about how to transition to this new normal and take advantage of this incredible once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to make the organization of your meetings more sustainable and effective. Please stand by as the next show will start momentarily.
Hey, dear viewers, welcome to our 7th episode this year. We are in mid-year, so we thought that sharing our reflections with you will be a nice way for you to spend the next 15-20 minutes or so with us. Welcome, Marty.
Good morning, Paul. Nice to see you again. How are you?
I'm doing excellent. Just arrived from an event yesterday in Braga, so it's quite busy for me this time of year with some events.
Super.
How about you?
Yeah, relatively quiet at the moment. A little bit busy on the work side, but on the personal side, just a family wedding last weekend. It was a fantastic success. So it's life is good, Paul. I have to say, life is good.
That's amazing. Having these family gatherings in the summer is amazing because it's
Absolutely.
like this, where the spirits are really begging for these kinds of encounters.
Well, we
Anyway,
certainly had some really interesting conversations so far this year, Paul. Just reflecting back as we've come to do this morning, like our year started interestingly with bridging from the last episode of last year with Eric, and our conversation with Eric then raised a couple of points, and we thought it would be very interesting to have a follow-on discussion with him. And Eric's main theme was around meeting design. He's a world expert in that area. A couple of things that he brought up, Paul, that I thought were really interesting. He identified 4 key issues that typically need to be addressed in meeting design. The first one he talked about was silos, and the idea that the organizations can work in silos, and then that the meetings can either reinforce those silos or be a possible way to break out of those silos, which I thought was a really interesting concept. A second point that he made, which was actually picked up in one of our later episodes with a completely different guest, was this idea of ownership and buy-in that's generated through meetings, and the idea of buy-in from the bottom up rather than trying to push ownership from the top down. So that was a particularly interesting point that he raised. He also talked about the idea of knowing that progress is being made, whether it's on individual topics or on the development of the organization and so on. So again, his point was that you can use the design of your meetings collectively as a way to enable the organization to see ongoing that progress on different issues, and as the organization itself is actually actively taking place. And the final point that he made around key issues that organizations can face, that meeting design can help to address, is this idea of sustainability. So the long-term sustainability of the organization and the role that designing your meetings can actually play in that. So there were 4 really interesting ideas or key issues that Eric identified that meeting design can in part help to address.
It's amazing, Mark, because when I listen to your reflections here, what I think is that perhaps meetings could be envisioned as a way to enact organizational development.
Absolutely.
Or enact change management. So it's a different way of looking at meetings, not as something that we need to do, but as a tool to achieve something else we want in an organization.
Absolutely, yeah. And you know, I'm thinking back, actually, we're meant to be reflecting on this year's meeting, Paul, or discussions, Paul, but I'm thinking back to some of the conversations we had, particularly with Elise Keith, and we might talk about Elise a little bit later as well. But there was a phrase that I used in one of our meetings that Elise particularly latched onto, and that is that meetings are windows to the soul of the organization. Mm-hmm. And I think Eric's discussions with us about meeting design very much reflected that idea, that, and I think it reinforces the point that you just made, that meetings aren't just something we have to suffer through. And Eric's point was, meetings are a tool. They're a vehicle through which we can do something with and for the organization, but we have to do it deliberately. We have to think about the meetings and how we can make best use out of the time and effort and energy that we invest into them. To that end, I suppose Eric also made a really important point, that as a principle of meeting design, he said, the idea of meeting design is to hold to opening the minds of the participants. So if we design our meetings with that as one of our key objectives, we then inform the way that we take part in the meetings, the way we conduct the meetings, how we plan for them, how we prepare, how we actually run them, where we run them. So there's a whole range of things that come into play that Eric touched on with us. If we adopt the principle of our meetings are there to open the minds of our participants, which I thought was, again, it was an interesting and a slightly different take than we might have previously been used to with some of our other conversations.
Mm-hmm. So true, so true. And what about other particular conversation we had in the first semester that caught your attention, Martin?
I'll stick with Eric just for the moment, actually, because again, we did two conversations with Eric, and one was a follow-on from the previous. He made a really interesting point about if an organization or participants in an organization feel that meetings are habitually poor or that they're not particularly enjoyable, he said very often that is not a problem with the meetings. He said that's a symptom of a problem with the organization. And again, it goes back to this idea that the meetings can be a window to the soul of the organization. And if you look beyond the meeting, and if you treat the meeting as a symptom of some malaise or some ailment that the organization is suffering from, then you have a better chance of being able to diagnose it if you have looked into the meetings in the first instance. So I guess the advice that you would infer from that, Paul, would be, if somebody thinks they're having constant problems with their meetings, maybe they need to have a more detailed look at the wider organization to say, what is that reflecting? Where is that coming from? And it's just showing itself through the meetings, but there may be a fundamentally different problem to be addressed at the whole organization level.
Mm-hmm. That's so curious, Martin, because as I was inviting our participants to watch our episode today, I realized that there are people approaching meetings from two different angles. There are the ones like us that are consultants and approach meetings with this perspective as a tool for organizational development. But there are also other professionals that approach meetings as coaches and trainers. And I'm wondering if for those professionals, wouldn't they be getting a superficial intervention on an organization, trying to make team building, whereas perhaps problems lie elsewhere deeper? Wouldn't that be a challenge for these other type of professionals?
Yes, it certainly would. But then I suppose there's a responsibility on people like ourselves, Paul, as professional consultants, that where we can identify issues within an organization through the work that we might do in analyzing their meetings, there comes a point where we don't have the requisite expertise or background or experience to deal with the specific details of a problem. So let me give you a for example here. Let's assume that somebody comes to us and says, could you sit in on 3 of our executive team meetings and just observe and just give us a sense of what you think is happening here? And I had occasion to do this relatively recently with one particular organization. So in giving the feedback, if we identified that we think there's an issue with bullying, I'm just making up an example now, but let's assume that we identified there seemed to be a pattern of repeated behavior by 2 individuals at 3 different meetings where it appeared they were adopting a bullying type approach. But if bullying isn't something that you and I as meeting consultants are expert in handling or dealing with, we might then have to say, look, we think that's the type of problem. That's not a meeting problem. That's an interpersonal, individual problem. It may be a cultural problem. And so now the nature of the problem might require us to refer the organization to a different expert. So it's a bit like our medical general practitioner. We go to the doctor with a problem. We have an ache in our leg. And the doctor says, actually, I think that could be a heart issue or a lung issue. There could be a blood clot. There could be an embolism. There could be now you get referred to a cardiologist or a pulmonary expert. So my point is that the work that we might do at the general meeting level, if it points where Eric is suggesting it can point into more detailed issues within the organization, it may be that we have to hand over or suggest handing over to a different expert to be able to resolve the issues that we might identify.
Absolutely. And this is interesting. We also approached executive meetings from frustration to focus with our 2 guests, Judy Rees and Penny Walker. This was really one of the most viewed episodes we had this year so far. Any particular notes from that one?
Yeah, absolutely. The standout for me from that one actually was the idea of clean language. And it was a concept that Judy introduced to us, and Penny readily kind of shared that. And I suppose the key point that was being made was that the language that gets used in our meetings, very often shared understanding can be the cost of not having a shared language. So the language used can be really, really important in trying to find this concept of consensus. And that was the second takeaway that I took from that meeting or from that episode that we had with Penny and Judy. Discovering consensus as opposed to driving towards consensus. And I'll just reference something that Judy said to us. Driving consensus is an act of coercion. That was the key point that Judy made. And I've dealt with consensus building over many, many years of the work that you and I have been involved in. But I've never heard anybody refer to consensus in that way. And it absolutely rang a bell in my head. Because if you push for consensus, it's an act of coercion. Whereas the point was, if you invite dissent, and by working through why we're dissenting, it may well be we're just speaking a different language. We're not using the same words to express ourselves. But by acknowledging that up front and by inviting disagreement, we have a much better chance of discovering consensus rather than driving consensus. So that was an absolute key takeaway about consensus building that I hadn't previously encountered or actually considered. And I thought it was really, really enlightening. That brought a third point that Penny and Judy brought us through, and it was the idea of degrees of consensus. So consensus isn't necessarily absolute, and equally consensus at a meeting versus consensus across a number of meetings of the organization versus consensus in wider networks that the organization is associated with. Again, that was a key point that they both took us through that I hadn't really thought about in the same way. So that was a particularly enlightening and particularly informative conversation with them, because I think they brought us onto familiar territory, but brought us into completely unfamiliar ways to see that territory, which I thought was really valuable and really interesting.
Yes, absolutely, Martin. I totally concur with you. And then we started to engage with meeting experts from the event industry. We had Adrian Seeger and peer conferences, and then we jumped also including our friends Bo Kruger and Dan Ram.
Yeah, that again, some really we've had a good year, Paul. we've had some really good conversations with our guests. Adrian was a kind of fascinating man to speak with. Peer conferences was Adrian's thematic area. The concept of peer conferences, that was really interesting. So the idea of there's no preset agenda, but what's common here is that groups of people with some shared interest come together. So now that means it's not industry specific, it's topic or it's theme specific, but not theme specific to drive agenda. So there is no agenda when this conference comes together. So if you have 50 or 100 people at one of these conferences, the very opening part of the conference then provided some insight as to how do you manage something that appears to have no agenda. But the whole concept was that the group themselves identify what are the issues that they want to talk about. So the organizers aren't setting an agenda in advance. The participants are the ones who set the agenda at the beginning of their conference. So it kind of reminded me a little, Paul, of open space technology as a methodology for running a conference. A little bit different, but the concept seems very similar. So that Adrian took us through a very thought-provoking idea that seemed counterintuitive, because my question, I remember asking him and saying, why would people come to this if there is no agenda? And effectively, his point back was, it's driven out of a networking process that's organic, and like-minded people coming together because there's some shared interest that they have in meeting with each other. And when they get together, they will identify their own key topics of conversation that then organically and dynamically build from that conference base, which again, it's different to the conventional pre-planned, pre-agended, pre-prepared meeting format that I thought was really, really interesting.
Amazing. And of course, we had also in the between Jim Kalbach, a returner from a previous episode, and Alexander Eisenstetter.
Yeah.
The Stormzy founder.
Yeah. And again, Alex was particularly enthusiastic about technology. Jim himself, we know is a very strong technology enthusiast. And the theme that we wanted to talk about was, can technology... So Jim and Alex actually, two very strong promoters of the use of technology in meetings. And our theme with Jim and Alex was, can technology make meetings redundant?
Mm-hmm.
It was very interesting, actually, in spite of their obvious enthusiasm for technology. That conversation brought both of us, or brought all of us, back to the fundamentals of meetings, which is they're about people. before they're about methods or procedures or technology, they're about people. They're about why we meet. The idea, the emphasis that both of them put on, we have to be clear on the purpose of the meeting before any form of technology can help us. Because if we're not clear on the purpose, it doesn't matter what technology we bring, we still have bad meetings. We talked about the flipped classroom and the idea of changing the formatting of meetings so that rather than having the classroom type concept of one person lecturing the class, the flipped classroom concept, and even in the use of the technology, how the classroom technology can be used in a different way to enable people to engage and interact. So again, both of them took us through that concept of the flipped classroom, and I'd suggest people jump into that episode because it was a really interesting and a really fascinating, quick guided tour through alternative ways to use technology in the management and the conduct of our meetings.
Absolutely. I would like to refer our viewers here to our website where you can find all these episodes recorded in video. This is mymeetingdoctors.com, and all the episodes that we have been talking about in these episodes are here, and all the recordings. So Martin, right here, perhaps we can have a glimpse on our plans for the next semester.
Yeah, there's just thinking about not just reflecting on the last 6 months, Paul, but actually reflecting on the last 2.5, almost 3 years that we've had these conversations. I suppose we've fallen into a little pattern, and that is that we've drawn from the experts of many different fields related to meetings, and we've gotten some magnificent insights from a wide range of participants. But it might be interesting actually over the next 6 months if we focused on, let's call them organization leaders. So chief executive officers, chief operating officers, chief technical officers, chief financial officers. So key leaders in the top leadership teams of organizations. If we had guests in that from that level who are willing to talk to us, not about the meeting having their current organization per se, but to talk to us about their personal management experience of meetings over the course of their careers. And then if we have our own guest speaker or attendee with some leaders from industry, I think we could have some really interesting conversations, because I think we will be joining up the owner practitioners of the meeting sphere with, I suppose, our expertise, yourself, myself, that we can bring to the table. But then if we brought in, maybe we could revisit some of our previous guest speakers, because when we look at the list of guest speakers we've had some really fantastic contributors. So maybe we could theme our next series of episodes around bringing in industry leaders, just one person at a time, to talk about their personal history or experience of organization meetings, and have an expert to hand where a four-way conversation about issues that have come up in somebody's experience, solutions that have been found, and maybe our broader listener base could benefit or learn from that kind of grounded practical experience, and then what the experts can actually bring to how some of the issues arising might be addressed. So I thought that might be an interesting format for us.
Absolutely, Martin. And let me just add also, I'll be curious to know not just particularly the manager, as you mentioned, because a person that is a professional manager, as he has already some kind of educational background.
Yeah.
That would equip her to make better decisions in a group with individuals. But I'm also wondering, Martin, if you could also invite entrepreneurs
Oh,
the ones who have built organizations with their bare hands.
Yeah.
Because sometimes we find these meeting theories, like Jeff Bezos' known theory that you shouldn't use PowerPoints in meeting in Amazon, right?
Yeah.
That kind of instinctive learning from entrepreneurs. Wouldn't you also be curious on
Absolutely.
getting some of them on board?
Yeah, and from entrepreneurs that I have both worked with and have spoken to, I think it would be really interesting to hear their take on the difference between the early stage of entrepreneurship, where dynamism, speed, agility, flexibility are all absolute prerequisites being able to move to the next steps, versus when they as entrepreneurs became more stabilized into conventional organizations, conventional practices, procedures, requirements. And I'd be really fascinated to hear the feedback they might have about that journey from dynamic, flexible, fast-paced changing into slowed down a little bit, constrained a little bit. I think there could be some really interesting conversations there, Paul, for absolute certainty.
Absolutely, Martin. And thank you so much for your reflections today, Martin. I've been recording this, and I'm sure that throughout August we're going to replay these comments and this interview with our viewers and our followers. Thank you so much for following us. Thank you so much for your comments and your feedback. Keep following us because we are here for you, and I hope you benefit from the conversations we share. Martin, over to you for last words.
Just a last word, Paul. If anybody is listening to this and if they would like to join us as a guest on our any of our episodes, please make contact with us. We'd love to talk to you. If you're an organization leader, if you have a story to tell or share with us about your experience of meetings, we'd absolutely love to hear from you and very willingly engage with you.
Fantastic. So looking forward to a great semester, everybody. Enjoy summer and see you all next month.
Thanks very much. See you soon.
Great.